Two paths converged in a wood. A Sundara story.
How much further?
Triana Vane groused. The heiress had only given minor thought to the road, and it was beginning to show. Her heavy braids of hair that had taken hours to put in were starting to fray, and sweat was beginning to darken the high collar of her blouse. Her boots, made for the stone streets of the city rather than long treks through the wilderness, were scuffed and scratched. Perhaps the thing that had undergone the greatest shift, though, was her tone. What had begun as a chipper mood looking forward to the adventure of travel had soured almost as soon as they'd entered the shadows of the forest road, and they were too far from home to turn back comfortably any longer. Rodram clucked his tongue and held up a hand. The woodsman had come prepared for the journey, unlike Triana and most of her retinue. They had paid his fee because he knew this road and he knew the dangers, but he'd made it clear they would follow his lead and do as he bade. Triana had her mouth open to let an acid word fly, but that was when Corlin touched her shoulder. "My lady, we are in the hunting grounds of the Hidubal," Corlin said, the soldier's voice low as he leaned into her. "It might be best to tread with caution until we have left the trees behind."
Is that so?
Triana said, her upper lip curling back.
Then where are these orcs, whom you seem so concerned about,
The words were scarcely out of Triana's mouth when she saw Rodram's eyes shift to her left. She turned and saw a figure standing in front of a tree who hadn't been there a moment ago. Long and lean, it had green skin and thick, coarse patches of hair along its arms and legs. Its mane was braided into a dozen different strands, and it wore little more than a pair of short breeches. Its jaw was thick with muscle, and when the lips drew back, it showed a mouth filled with sharp fangs. Other orcs stepped onto the road, seemingly materializing out of thin air. There were perhaps a dozen of them, and while each was different in their details, they were all of a similar type. A few bore spears, others bows, but for the most part they were unarmed except for what nature had given them. Lady Triana's retinue glanced nervously around. Corlin folded his arms across his broad chest, keeping his hands well away from the sword at his waist.
What are you doing?
Triana demanded, hissing between her teeth. The first orc who had appeared spoke, staring straight at her. Triana didn't understand any of the growling, snarling words, but her guide appeared to. Rodram answered, pointing at Triana with his chin as he pulled his lips back from his own teeth. He glanced at her and said 2 words. "Don't move." Triana stared straight ahead as the orc bent down to her eye level. Her breathing came hard as she watched his nostrils flare like those of a hunting hound getting a scent. He looked her up and down, nodded, then turned away. The orc held out his hand to Rodram. The guide clasped the orc's forearm and they spoke rapidly in the orc's tongue.
What is that filthy brute doing?
Triana demanded in a too loud whisper. "I believe Rodram is speaking with the leader of the pack," Corlin said. Triana shot her bodyguard a withering look, but his attention was on the orcs all around them.
You know what I mean,
Triana said.
Why are they holding us here?
If you would walk into dangers unaware, then you are an even greater fool than you look,
the pack leader said, and loudly enough for all of them to hear. Triana's mouth slowly dropped open, and she gaped.
You can speak?
She finally managed.
You think your tongue's so hard to learn?
One of the other orcs said from where she leaned against a tree, her arms crossed beneath her breasts.
You only have one word for scent. As to scent, ensure she drinks more water on this journey, Rodram,
the pack leader said to the guide.
I can smell the salt leaking from her. 2 days like this and she'll collapse, and you have at least a fortnight ahead of you.
Rodram made a low, growling noise that seemed to come up from his chest. The pack leader returned it. The 2 of them slapped first their palms and then the backs of their hands together. The pack leader whooped and gestured with his hand. As one, the orcs stepped off the path and back into the trees. A dozen heartbeats later, it was as if they had never been there at all.
The audacity!
Triana managed.
How dare they speak to me in that fashion?
Minanka are sensitive to insults, and the Hidubal more than most, Rodram said. You're the one who started it, first by disparaging Shantak's cleanliness, then by assuming none of them spoke your language. They might let one of those pass as a guest privilege, but they weren't going to give you 2 and keep smiling.
Remember who it is that's paying you.
Triana said, stamping her foot. Rodram slid a water bag off his shoulder and tossed it at her. Shantak was right about your drinking, the guide said, turning and starting to walk back down the trail. We're not on a stroll through your garden. As to your silver, it's resting patiently in the gold miser's vault waiting for my return. We're wasting daylight, and I'd prefer to key at a roadside cabin before dark. According to the pack, the night bears are getting restless, and I'd rather not contend with them if I didn't have to.
Night bears?
Triana said softly, turning toward Corlin.
He's jesting, isn't he?
I don't believe Rodram has a sense of humor, Corlin said, letting his hand rest near his weapon. Come on, best to hurry.